Welcome to the fifth and final episode of Philosophy is Philosophy through a Creative Perspective. Philosophy is an attempt to understand both life and death. Life is existence. It can be seen as our chance to have beautiful experiences. On the other hand, death is the end of existence, the point where there are no more opportunities. It's the end of everything we know. And sometimes that's scary. But is death really the end of existence? Or is it just the end of the only existence we've ever known as humans? After death, do we continue to exist in a different form with our personal identity and self-consciousness intact? To believe in such an afterlife, one would most likely believe also in a distinction between our minds and our body, and believe in a soul that could survive after our bodies die. Philosophy, religion, science, and other disciplines, fields of knowledge, and human practices, they all try to answer these grand questions about life and death, so much so that there are a multitude of contrasting views on what happens when we die. Will we ever know for sure what happens when we die? Can an afterlife be proven? For now, all we have are theories. In one of my favorite TV shows of all time, known as The Good Place, the entire plot occurs in an afterlife where only the most incredibly good people in the world get into a place known as the good place. In most theories of life and death that incorporate an afterlife, there is a common element of morality, the idea of good and bad, and how one should live their current life so as to have a better eternity after death. In essence, to have a theory on life after death is to also have a theory on human existence and morality. Morality and ethics make up the branch of philosophy that deals with the concepts of good and evil, with ethics going further to investigate which actions and principles should and should not be performed in certain situations. While morality is mainly dealing with defining good and evil, ethics takes many steps further and tries to define a certain code of conduct for a particular situation. When learning about moral philosophy, you will quickly realize that there are various personal duties, cultures, norms, and values that all influence human behavior, belief, and action in the world. A form of ethics known as normative ethics tends to evaluate principles and actions for their goodness, evilness, rightness, or wrongness, regardless of possible cultural, linguistic, and other differences. There is an idea under philosophy known as moral intuitionism that explores the idea that at our core, we have or can develop an underlying moral insight that already guides us on what is good and what is bad. Even with this possible moral intuition, ethics explores particular instances in which it's still very difficult to know what is right from wrong. These situations are known as moral dilemmas. One famous moral dilemma situation explored in philosophy is one titled The Trolley Problem. In The Good Place, a character named Michael causes characters Eleanor and Chidi to experience this moral dilemma in a realistic simulation, and it's amazingly entertaining and philosophical at the same time.
I made the trolley problem real so we could see how the ethics would actually play out. There are 5 workers on this track and 1 over there. Here are the levers to switch the tracks. Make a choice.
The thing is, ethically speaking...
No time, dude! Make a decision!
Well, it's tricky! On the one hand, if you ascribe to a purely utilitarian...
Chidi, despite being an actual moral philosophy professor, is horrible at making moral decisions in this moral dilemma. And it was only at the end of the episode that they discussed that the only moral decision that could be devised in that moment to them was to make the choice to turn over the entire trolley and only harm themselves. There is the idea that essentially goodness is strongly connected to how you relate to others, and if you harm others, that is wrong. And because of this notion, there is conspiracy about concepts like capital punishment and euthanasia, where people are killed illegally as punishment or per request. If life is good and allows one to flourish, then taking life should be bad. So often is life seen as good and grand and full of opportunities, and death is seen as bad and as a punishment for sin and as a darkness that we cannot overcome. But as explored in episode 4, perspective makes a difference. Perspective can determine how one views life and death. It is perspective that can cause one to see life as the darkness that we cannot overcome and death as a good thing. In an amazing movie known as Me Before You, the main character feels his life had already ended when he became paralyzed and lost all of his physical abilities because who he was and is deeply rooted in being active and being an athlete. And major spoiler alert, but in the end, he requests to die by way of euthanasia because to him, death was good and life wasn't anymore. But he still wanted his caretaker and his love interest, Louisa, to live her life to the fullest because he realized that even though his life ended, hers hadn't even started yet. She needed to start living for herself and doing what she loved. And that is the moral philosophy of the film, that life is good when you can access your full potential and do what makes you happy and fulfilled. And so evidently, our perceptions of good and bad influence how we live life and how we feel towards death. To me, life and death are what you make of it, and death shouldn't be feared. Instead, it should be appreciated as the thing that makes us appreciate life in the first place. Thank you for listening to my podcast on philosophy and its many definitions, theories, and concepts. I hope you enjoyed learning about philosophy through a creative perspective and learned a little bit more about the possible realities we often leave unexplored.